In this video, we'll be looking at the theme of friendship in Of Mice and Men. If you are familiar with my videos, you'll already know that I focus a lot on the Edexcel IGCSE English Literature exam. However, this is definitely relevant to all students covering the text. The theme is the theme, but just a heads up, you'll see some things highlighted in yellow. That's kind of referencing knowledge and understanding of the text. And what is in blue references contextual understanding. If you are doing the Edexcel IGCSE English Literature exam, you need both in your answer. You get 50% of your marks come from your knowledge and understanding, 50% come from context. So just a reminder, but if you're not doing that exam, you can just ignore the highlighted, what's highlighted in yellow and what's highlighted in blue. Okay, let's get started. My advice, first of all, before I actually do go into detail about the theme of friendship, I have seen like some of my students that have practiced this question often focus on the absence of friendship, which I think is important for this question if you did get a question on this. But I think to truly answer a question on whatever theme it is, you have to definitely find examples of that thing as well. So, here, my advice, writing an essay on friendship, of course, it's useful to talk about the absence of friendship. But I think primarily you want to focus on those instances where you see friendship. Okay, just a bit of advice. Okay, so before we move on to look at specific references from the text, I think it's really important to think about the backdrop of this novella, which is this really hostile setting. So you'll want to be mentioning these four things, I think, to explain why in the 1930s in the United States, why was it so difficult to establish and maintain friendships? So I'd expect to hear about the Dust Bowl. There's more information on the screen, but basically this is an ecological disaster. It causes 2.5 million people to migrate from the southern plains to places like California. And what does that mean? It means people are displaced, people have to move away from their families, or if you're younger, it means you have no roots anymore. It's very difficult for you to settle down, have a family, establish friendships, because you're on the move trying to find work and trying to survive. Similar, really, is in terms of its effects, is the Great Depression. So this is not an ecological disaster, this is an economic disaster, okay? Starting with the Wall Street crash in 1929, and it's kind of a vicious cycle. So what happens? People lose their savings. If people lose their savings, they don't spend money. If they're not spending money, industrial production plummets. If industrial production plummets, then people are laid off work. So now there's this high rate of unemployment. And what does that mean? It means there's very few jobs out there for the amount of people on the market. That means that people can lower wages and so on. If you're on lower wages, you're not spending money, and then the vicious cycle begins. Okay, so how does that link to friendship? Well, again, it means that you're so poor, you're only focusing on surviving, right? And what does that mean for migrant workers like Lennie and George and so on? It means you have to keep on the move to find that work. And therefore, again, you're not rooted anywhere. You don't have the capacity to make friendships or even just to invest in other people because you are so focused on surviving. I think it's really important and often overlooked Steinbeck's feelings on industrial capitalism. He was very critical of the capitalist system. What I have read from students before, and I think please avoid this, you can be critical of the capitalist system and not necessarily be a socialist. So I have read that a few times in students' work where they say Steinbeck was a socialist. He never ever directly said he was a socialist. So just be careful to not be too kind of binary with that, but he was critical of the capitalist system that existed in the 1930s. And we will look at this in a greater detail in the other slides, but he basically felt like this system really focused on just exploiting the poor, entrapping them in this kind of vicious cycle where they couldn't survive. And again, that just kind of took their attention away from making meaningful relationships and focusing really solely on surviving. And it also kind of pitted people against each other, right? Because in this capitalist system, we're all in competition with one another to get the same job. And therefore, you get this kind of sense of individualism, which we'll look at a bit more as well. And then on top of all of that, we have a society that is very prejudiced. You're going to see examples of ageism, ableism, racism, sexism. All of those things get in the way of us creating meaningful connection with others when we have these prejudices in our minds. So we'll look at that a little as well. So just keep that in mind as the backdrop, and maybe you would include that in your introduction as like, let's just, as a reminder, this is the backdrop. This is why friendships were not common, especially amongst migrant workers, and this is why George and Lennie really stand out. And that's who I would argue you should talk about first. So what quotes, and of course there are lots of quotes you could choose for all of the things that I'm about to argue, but I've chosen what I think give you the best opportunity to kind of explore those notions as much as possible. But when explaining that George and Lennie have a meaningful relationship or friendship, I would focus on the quote, I got you to look after me and you got me to look after you. You could describe this as a mantra because it is a statement that is repeated throughout the novella. And that really emphasizes the mutuality of care in George and Lennie's friendship. In other words, it's a very equal relationship if you focus on that statement. So that nature, that egalitarian nature of the friendship creates this stark contrast to the capitalist world in which they live, right? In Steinbeck's eyes, remember, he's very critical of the industrial capitalist system that is the kind of basis of the United States at that time, because he believes it creates a society in which power must always be established through the exploitation of the weak. There's no space for friendship. Everyone's in competition with each other and no one wants to lose. And so it really just creates this contrast of this hostile environment, this hostile economic system in the eyes of Steinbeck. And then to support that, to support this kind of contrast of George and Lennie's friendship and what that kind of offers us when we're reading this novella, I think a good example is the way that George promotes Lennie to the boss. He says, he's sure a hell of a good worker, strong as a bull. And I think this is a really great example of how their friendship goes against the grain. No one else is having a friendship, right? No one's got time. Everyone's traveling on their own. And again, they're not investing in anyone other than themselves. But here, George isn't seeing Lennie as his competition, as the capitalist market would encourage. He sees him as a comrade that he is deeply loyal to, and he wants to support his success. Also, it's important that Lennie gets a job as well as an employed just as much as George. And I'm sure if the boss had turned around and said, I'm not going to employ Lennie, George would have left with him. So given the high unemployment rates during this time and the intense competition for work, it would be deemed unusual to see an employer promoting someone else. So this really just kind of supports this sense that this is a true friendship where they look out for one another. However, as we've already kind of talked about, this friendship is seen as an oddity in this world in the 1930s. It was not common to see this kind of brotherhood in the setting that they are in. And we see this with the way the boss immediately is suspicious over George for the care that he has for Lennie, right? When he says, what stake you got in this guy? So he thinks, George has ulterior motives and is probably taking his money off him or something. So this already highlights that it's unusual to witness a friendship, right? Could you imagine that if you're just being, a typical friend with whoever your closest friend is, and someone's just like, what's going on here? This something suspicious going on. Well, no, we're just friends. But this emphasizes the lonely life of a typical migrant worker during the 1930s, because they'd have to travel to secure work, meaning very little opportunity to establish those meaningful and lasting friendships that George and Lennie have. And just a reminder that George and Lennie have known each other for a very long time. George does talk to Slim about knowing him from a young age. The boss is a symbol of capitalism. So him being a symbol of capitalism through the character of the boss, Steinbeck is really showcasing the inherent cruelty of the economic system that fosters competition over camaraderie, to the point that the boss can't even recognize a genuine friendship when it's put in front of him. And his instinct is to treat it with suspicion rather than just being like, oh, that's nice. Isn't that a nice friendship? We also see this right at the end of the novella. Just a reminder, this is when George has killed Lennie, sorry for the spoiler, and Slim is comforting George, and they walk off, and they seem very sad, obviously, because George felt like he had no choice but to kill Lennie. But Carlson does not get why they'd be upset. And he says, now what the hell are you supposed to eating them two? He goes, why are they so upset? That's terrifying to me, okay, that he cannot comprehend the sadness of George and Slim over the death of Lennie, okay? Because what that reveals is that Carlson is completely emotionally detached from others, and he has a complete disregard for human life as well. Regardless of what he thinks Lennie is responsible for, it should still be difficult to see a dead body before your eyes, and also you should be able to understand that someone was close to that person, that they would feel sad about that. So through the character of Carlson, is Steinbeck demonstrating the catastrophic consequences of rugged individualism through Carlson? I should explain what rugged individualism is. That was a ideology, if you like, that President Hoover at the time promoted. He didn't believe in government aid, at least at the beginning, the first half of the 1930s, even though we have this ecological and economic disaster before our eyes. He didn't think that the best thing to do was to help people. He believed that, people should just kind of stiff up a lip and fight through it, and you'll get through it. He did not believe in government handouts. He just thought, you have to kind of fight for yourself in this world. And so you might argue that has kind of created this ripple effect down to people like Carlson, who have become completely detached from others. And again, bringing this back to friendship, someone like Carlson is never going to be capable of a meaningful friendship if he's not able to have that kind of attachment. However, if you want to get those higher marks, right, again, talking about the Edexcel exam, and get those level 5s on the mark scheme, you want to critically analyse throughout, okay? And you could argue that this isn't really a meaningful friendship between George and Lennie. Look at some of these examples. George calls Lennie a good boy, almost like a pet, or at least a young child. Lennie imitates George exactly, even by the way he stands. And Slim observes the way Lennie is and says to George, he's just like a kid, ain't he? So one could argue that this isn't a true friendship, and that if you look at the dynamics, that this seems more like a paternal relationship than it does actually a friendship. And you could link this to the poor care offered, or any poor options really offered to anyone with mental illnesses, right? What options does George have? He doesn't have many. The one is to have Lennie admitted into a mental institution. With there being very little understanding of mental illness, there was just terrifying, inhumane care in these institutions where, Lennie could be tied up to a bed all day. He could be heavily sedated. He could have electric shock therapy, all these things that now we know do not work and are ineffective and cruel in treating those with mental illnesses. So you might argue George doesn't really have a friendship. He just has a great sense of responsibility towards Lennie. And so it could be argued this isn't a true friendship, which is really sad because it's the closest thing we see to a friendship in this novella. And then, of course, that offers all kinds of questions of, the world that they live in. That this is the closest we see to a friendship. That could be supported by the fact that George is repeatedly described as playing the card game solitaire, which, if you're not aware of, is played by one person. And that could symbolise the fact that he is lonely. He's not alone because he always has Lennie, but he is lonely. And that, of course, could indicate that Lennie doesn't provide apt companionship for George. And this could also foreshadow the life ahead of George as well, that just like all the other migrant workers, he's destined to navigate this world alone as is, you might argue, the only way to survive in this world. And we'll come back to this idea again. Is it really possible? Is it wise to even have a friendship during this time? However, coming back again, critical analysis is it's not really coming up with an answer or a solid answer. It's just exploring different ways to think of things. And you can always, again, kind of criticize what you've just criticized, right? And come back to what Crook said. Don't make no difference who the guy is, long as he's with you. So it's worth coming back to Crook's conclusion. Being arguably the loneliest character on the ranch, he can appreciate the importance of human connection regardless of the quality of it. So it doesn't matter that this might not be, by our standards, the best friendship. It is a type of friendship, and in this time, that's better than nothing. And just as a reminder, why is Crooks arguably the loneliest character on the ranch? Well, that would be because he's black and he's living in an incredibly racist society, one that is supported by the law or justified by the law. And there you really want to be referencing the Jim Crow laws that provided a legal basis for segregation. And that is why Crooks has his own place to stay. He's not allowed in the bunkhouse, and he doesn't really have much interaction with the white folk on the farm. And so, of course, that makes him the loneliest character in this novella. But what we do see, even though these friendships are fleeting, you could argue, to show your knowledge of the text, you want to go beyond George and Lennie, though that's the obvious thing to focus on. But I would say to have a really detailed essay, you might struggle to demonstrate so much detailed knowledge of the theme of friendship if you only focus on George and Lennie. So I think it's a good idea to also talk about these fleeting moments of friendship and what they do to people. And I think, so as examples, Crooks does eventually, he's quite aloof at the beginning, but Lennie kind of, I guess because he doesn't read the situation, but Lennie doesn't leave Crooks's room, and Crooks eventually opens up to him and says, a guy goes nuts if he ain't got nobody. All right, this moment is like a friendly moment, right? Crooks is opening up and telling Lennie how he really feels, that he's desperately lonely. Look at how Candy speaks with George and Lennie about sharing this American dream of owning a ranch of their own, and he says, I'd make a will and leave my share to you guys. So look at how kind he's being. Look how he wants to have that connection with George and Lennie and wants to create that community with them. When Lennie's the only person really who speaks to Curly's wife in the end, and she opens up to him and tells him, the state of her marriage. I don't like Curly. He ain't a nice fella. Through that, we learn that she's mistreated by her husband. Obviously, we get snippets and it's hinted throughout, but here it is from her mouth that, she's not happy in her marriage and he's not nice to her. And then the way Slim and George interact as well. Slim is very open, he's non-judgmental, and he creates a really safe space for George to speak to Slim. It invited confidence without demanding it. And that's why George ends up opening up, telling him about his past with Lennie. We learn about how he used to be mean to him, and then he felt really guilty and vowed to, never leave Lennie behind. We learn about what happened in Weed because George feels safe with Slim. And we get to understand Lennie more and the complexity of looking after him. And we get to understand why George can lose his temper with Lennie as well. But the point is, if you are kind to someone and if you give them that moment of friendship, you get to understand them. You give them a safe space to open up and learn more about their character. And as a reader, we get to learn about these characters, right? So although fleeting, these small moments of friendship encourage the characters to open up. It gives the reader a chance to understand the characters on a deeper level and see their kinder sides. They become more human to us and to each other. In these moments, the power of friendship seems to knock down those social barriers, okay? So as an example, we've got Curly's wife. No one wants to speak to her because she's a woman and she's a married woman. She shouldn't be speaking to any other man other than her husband, right? So there, you want to be referencing that patriarchal society in which she lives and this really binary idea of what a married woman should be like. She should be at home, she shouldn't be on the ranch. She should not be hanging around with other men. We have Candy, right? He lives, you know, this is an ableist world. Sorry, an ageist world, and ableist. He's also disabled as well. Um, and you could argue, you know, he's just seen as someone who eventually is going to be useless on the ranch, be thrown onto the street. But this gives him a moment where he thinks there's a future for him. Again, that's just knocking down those barriers. Crooks opens up to Lennie. Crooks is incredibly intelligent. Lennie, we know, has a mental illness, um, which affects his intelligence levels. But in this moment, Crooks is being really honest with him and speaking to him as an equal. Um, so it's just so interesting to see how like friendships can kind of knock down those social barriers. And for a snippet, we don't see that prejudice, and it gives people that a break from the prejudice that they are subjected to on a daily basis, and it just gives them a moment of relief. So you could say here that Steinbeck is using these moments to highlight the importance of human connection and the comfort it can bring during hard times. However, and I feel sad to kind of end this in this way, but I do think this is, for me, this is the message I take from it, is that unfortunately, because of the world that's been created in Steinbeck's eyes, right? And I think he does, personally, I think he's blaming industrial capitalism um, for a significant amount of this. Of the system that they've created means that, you know, you just create these really vulnerable people who've got no choice but to look out for themselves. And if you are looking out for others, then you're not going to survive this world, because it's not the world that you live in, and it's just not going to work. So in that sense, I feel like, unfortunately, I think friendships are presented as a risky business. And I think Slim kind of summarizes this really well when he's thinking about, you know, you don't see many people travel together. He's talking to George about how unusual it is to see, you know, two ranch workers have this long-lasting friendship. And he is established as a wise and intuitive character, so we as readers kind of trust his observations. And he observes that people's loneliness stems from fear. So could we link this to the way Steinbeck feels about the capitalist economy? So could Steinbeck be making a greater point here about the society that a capitalist economy has created? Does capitalism pit people against one another in the name of competition, with very little to no government aid offered in the name of rugged individualism, as we talked about before? Is it too risky to focus on anything but survival? So even the people at the top, right? So if you think about the boss and Curly, they've got too much to lose. They don't live in a world where there's an established welfare state. If their business flops, then they're on the streets, right? That's kind of the risk and reward that comes with this capitalist economy. And so it creates fear from the top right down to the bottom, and it just makes people cruel. And again, it just means you just can't risk investing time and energy into friendships. And there's great examples to say it is risky behavior, and the big question mark next to whether these friendships really paid off, right? With George's friendship with Lennie, you know, Lennie's always getting into trouble. He's a liability. And in the end, George has to do a terrible thing that he's never, ever, ever going to get over. And that's shoot his friend in the head, right? He gets into trouble all the time. Look at Curly's wife and what she says to Crooks. I could get you so strung up on a tree. It ain't even funny, I think she says, right? Now, that might seem strange to put down for friendship, but in that moment, Crooks opened up. He starts speaking to Lennie, he starts speaking to Candy, they start sharing a dream of living on a ranch. Crooks starts to get kind of swept away with this idea, and suddenly he's part of this community. And that was dangerous for him to even speak to white people, because look what happens. Curly's wife comes in and says, you know, I could get you lynched so easily, it ain't even funny, okay? So here, that was risky behaviour for Crooks to open up to white people. That's dangerous business for a black man in the 1930s. Curly's wife opens up to Lennie, but isn't it sad to think that causes her death, right? He ends up breaking her neck. And then Candy, you might argue, even just kind of entertaining the idea of being on the ranch, being part of this community with George and Lennie, you know, his eyes blind with tears when Curly's wife dies, and he says to George, "Is this still going to happen?" And George says no. And he's just beside himself. He's so upset. And there's almost a sense of like, he shouldn't have even entertained it because it wasn't worth the disappointment in the end. It was never going to happen anyway. So there's just this sense of like, unfortunately, this sense of hopelessness at the end of the novella, that the world in which they live, it just doesn't work for you to have a friendship. That's quite sad. And of course, you can take this very differently. This is just the way I read it, and maybe it's just the way my mind thinks. But unfortunately, that's what I take from it. But I will say that Steinbeck, I don't think was saying don't bother with friends. I think he was trying to highlight how awful society is, and the big changes that need to happen in the world at large to ensure that we can have these meaningful human connections. So I don't think he was actually trying to put anyone off friendship, but what he was really trying to do was criticize the system in which we live. So I think the overall message, remember, when you come to your conclusion to get those higher marks, you want to have a overall message. Please don't just summarize the friendship of George and Lennie. You know, you want to think about Steinbeck's point. What was the point of having the theme of friendship? And I think, first of all, like I said, I think the point was for him to highlight how important it is to have human connection, because it comforts us and it reminds us of our own and others' humanity. It kind of reminds us of who we are. However, I think his other point is that the capitalist economy contradicts that human need for connection, and it's created a landscape that makes it almost impossible to have meaningful friendships. And so I think the point really was for him almost like a call to action, that we need to seriously change this system and help those that are most vulnerable in our society. Please feel free to share your own ideas in the comment section. I love reading them. I don't always get a chance to respond, but I do read them all. And I know other students find it really helpful to read other interpretations. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me, Mrs. Rumsey at mrsrumsey.com.